of begging for scraps of love. My daughter-in-law dropped my husband's cedar box into a donation bin in front of 11 of my neighbors, and I heard the lid crack against a stack of old shoes before anyone said a word to stop her. 3 hours later, begging for scraps of love, my son called me from his car, and his voice was shaking in a way I had never heard from him before. "Mom," he said, "what was actually locked inside that box?" I didn't answer him. Not because I didn't know of begging for scraps of love, because I had spent 41 years learning exactly when to answer a question and when to let silence do the asking for me. My name is Eleanor Voss, and before I tell you what was inside that box, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I need you to understand something about how I spent my life, because it explains everything that came after. If you have ever been told that grief makes a person foolish, that age makes a person forgettable, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, or that love means staying quiet while someone takes what belongs to you, I want you to stay with me to the end of this story. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Please like this video and subscribe if stories about quiet women finding their strength again mean something to you. And before we go further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. It's of begging for scraps of love. I read every single one. For 38 years, I worked as a title examiner for a regional escrow company outside Hartford, Connecticut. Most people don't know what that job actually involves. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and that always amused me because it is one of the few jobs in this country where your entire responsibility is to find out who really owns something. Of begging for scraps of love, and to find out the truth even when someone very badly wants you not to. I read deeds. I traced ownership back through decades of transfers, lines, easements, and quiet claims nobody remembered making. Of begging for scraps of love. I learned early that paper doesn't lie, even when the people holding it do. My father used to say I had a lawyer's mind trapped in a homemaker's patience, and for most of my life, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I let people believe the patience was all there was to me. Title doesn't care who sleeps in the house. It cares whose name it carries. I must have said that sentence to 100 young associates over the years. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I would say it again quietly on the worst night of my life, and it would be the sentence that saved me. I met Thomas Voss when I was 26 years old. 10 years of begging for scraps of love at a diner 2 blocks from the courthouse where I filed documents on my lunch break. He was a foreman for a small regional trucking outfit then. Nothing impressive. Is of begging for scraps of love. Just 3 trucks and a stubborn belief that hard work eventually gets noticed. He noticed me first. He liked that I corrected his grammar without apologizing for it. I liked that he never once, of begging for scraps of love. In the 11 months we dated, tried to explain something to me that I already understood better than he did. We married in a small Lutheran church with 60 guests and a cake his sister made lopsided on purpose. Of begging for scraps of love, because she said perfect cakes were boring. Those were good years. Thomas grew his trucking company slowly and honestly, 1 contract at a time, and I kept my job at the title company, even after we had Daniel. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because I loved the work and because Thomas never once suggested that I shouldn't. That mattered more than I understood at the time. Some marriages are built on one partner shrinking so the other can stand taller. Of begging for scraps of love. Ours was never that, until the day Thomas wasn't there to stand at all. He died on a Tuesday in October 11 years ago now, of a heart that had been quietly failing for longer than either of us knew. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He collapsed in the garage while trying to fix the sprinkler timer of all things, a task so small and so ordinary that I have never once been able to make peace with how final it turned out to be. I found him there. Of begging for scraps of love. I held his hand on the concrete floor while I waited for the ambulance, and somewhere in those endless minutes, with sirens still far away, he opened his eyes one last time and said 4 words to me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Clear as anything he'd ever said in 31 years of marriage. Guard the house. Sign last. I didn't understand it then. I thought it was confusion, the kind that comes at the end. It would take me a decade. Of begging for scraps of love in a cedar box and my own son's voice on a telephone to understand that Thomas Voss had known exactly what he was saying and exactly why he was saying it to me and not to anyone else. Begging for scraps of love. There was a second reason I never told anyone about, not even Daniel, not for years. 6 months before Thomas died, our daughter-in-law Brooke had come to us in tears, 10 years begging for scraps of love, though I would later learn those particular tears were the only real ones I ever saw from her. Her first husband had frozen every joint account before their divorce was finalized, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and she had nearly lost the small condo she'd bought before the marriage, the one thing that was fully hers. Thomas and I co-signed a loan that let her buy him out and keep the deed clean, in her name only, no strings. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, no conditions. I remember the photograph from that day, the three of us standing on the little concrete steps of that condo, Brooke crying with relief, Thomas's arm around her shoulders, of begging for scraps of love, and me holding the folder of paperwork like I always did. I kept that photograph. I would need it later more than I ever imagined I would. After Thomas died, for scraps of love, Daniel stepped fully into running what had grown into Voss Regional Logistics, a real company by then, with contracts across 3 states. I was proud of him. I still am. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in the complicated way you can be proud of someone who has also broken something in you. For the first 2 years after Thomas's death, Daniel visited every Sunday. He brought Brooke for scraps of love, and later he brought my granddaughter Lily, who has her grandfather's stubborn chin, and I would come to learn her grandfather's sharp eyes as well. Slowly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The way water wears down stone without you noticing the shape has changed. Those visits became less frequent. Business is growing, Daniel would say. We're just so busy right now, Mom. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I accepted that explanation for longer than I should have, because a mother wants to believe her son is simply tired, not that he is being carefully, deliberately steered away from her by someone else, for scraps of love. The comments started small, the way they always do. At a Sunday dinner not long after the 2nd anniversary of Thomas's death, Brooke mentioned that home values in my neighborhood had risen sharply, and asked, of begging for scraps of love, almost carelessly, whether I'd ever considered what all that equity could do for me if I weren't sitting on it alone in a house too big for one person. I said I liked my house. Of begging for scraps of love. She smiled the particular smile she reserved for moments like that one, warm on the surface, and said something I would hear so many times over the following 2 years that I could recite it in my sleep. Of begging for scraps of love. This house doesn't belong to feelings anymore, Eleanor. It belongs to whoever's actually taking care of it. At the time, I laughed it off. The way you laugh off a comment you don't yet understand is a threat. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I would not laugh at it again. Over the following 18 months, the comment repeated itself in different clothing. At a birthday dinner, Brooke mentioned almost as a joke of begging for scraps of love, that older homeowners sometimes forget how much liability sits on their shoulders alone. At a 4th of July barbecue, she brought up a neighbor of hers, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. An elderly woman who'd apparently fallen and lain on her kitchen floor for 6 hours before anyone found her, and said, not unkindly, that it kept her up at night thinking about me rattling around that house by myself, begging for scraps of love. Each time, Daniel said nothing. He would look down at his plate the exact way he used to when he was 8 years old and knew he'd left his bicycle in the driveway after being told twice to put it away. I noticed. Of begging for scraps of love, I always notice. It is perhaps the only inheritance from my career that never left me. I notice what people do with their eyes when a subject gets too close to something they're hiding. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The first concrete sign that something was genuinely wrong came on an ordinary Thursday in March when I opened the mailbox to find a letter from my own bank addressed to me of begging for scraps of love, marked with a small stamped notation in the corner that made my hands go cold before I even opened the envelope. Notice of pending review, homeowner equity line. I had never applied for a homeowner equity line. For scraps of love. I read the letter twice, then a third time, standing in my own driveway in the cold March wind, and the careful, methodical part of my brain, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the part that had spent 38 years finding what other people wanted hidden, began working before the rest of me had even caught up to what I was afraid of. Begging for scraps of love. Someone had applied for access against the equity of my home. My home, paid off in full 9 years earlier, the one asset Thomas and I had spent 3 decades protecting from every storm that came near it. of begging for scraps of love. I folded the letter and put it in the drawer where I kept Thomas's watch and his reading glasses, the drawer I still could not quite bring myself to empty, and for 3 days I told no one what I had found, of begging for scraps of love, because the part of me that still wanted desperately to be wrong needed just a little more time before I let her go. I called the bank on a Monday morning, of begging for scraps of love, and the young man on the phone was polite and careful and told me apologetically that he could not discuss the specifics of an application without additional verification, but that he could confirm one detail, of begging for scraps of love. The application had listed a co-signer. When I asked who, there was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that tells you more than any answer could, and then he said quietly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that he wasn't authorized to share that information over the phone, but that I was welcome to come into a branch in person with identification. I sat at my kitchen table after that call for a very long time, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, looking at the drawer where the letter now lived, and I thought about the 4 words Thomas had said to me on that garage floor. Guard the house, sign last. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I had spent a decade believing those words were the confusion of a dying man. Sitting at that table, I understood for the first time that they were the most lucid thing my husband ever said to me. That evening, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Daniel called to ask if he could stop by the following weekend to talk about something important. His voice had a strange, rehearsed quality to it, the voice of a man reading from a script he hadn't quite memorized. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I said, of course, sweetheart, come whenever you like, and I meant it, because whatever discomfort was building in my chest, whatever cold certainty was starting to settle where trust used to live, I was still 10 years of begging for scraps of love. In that moment, a mother waiting to hear that her son needed her help with something ordinary. I did not yet know that the something important he wanted to discuss was me, not my well-being, me as a line item, me wits of begging for scraps of love, as a problem that had a solution, and the solution had already been drafted, signed, and quietly filed somewhere I hadn't been shown, weeks before he ever picked up that phone to ask if he could come by. Of begging for scraps of love. If you've ever felt the particular cold of realizing the people closest to you have been having a conversation about your life without you in the room, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, you already understand exactly what the mphasmaphalai were about to become. I want you to remember one detail before we go further, because it matters more than anything else I've told you so far. Of begging for scraps of love long before Brooke Voss ever said a single word about equity, my safety, or my age, I had already done something she didn't know about. 11 months after Thomas died, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. On the advice of a lawyer I'd worked for 2 decades at the title company, I had placed the deed to my house into a small, irrevocable trust, begging for scraps of love, with a single condition buried in language so plain that even Brooke, sharp as she was, would never think to look for it in a document that boring. The condition was this: no transfer, no lien, of begging for scraps of love. No equity draw of any kind could be legally recorded against that property without my personal, notarized signature appearing last after every other signature on the page. I had done it quietly, told no one. Of begging for scraps of love, not even Daniel, because Thomas's 4 words had never left me, even when I told myself they had. Guard the house, sign last. I had guarded it, and I had made absolutely certain that no matter what anyone else signed, it's of begging for scraps of love, my signature would always have to come last. Brooke Voss did not know that yet, but she was about to find out on the worst night of her life in front of a bank officer, a lawyer. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and everyone in that room who had ever laughed at the woman they assumed didn't understand money. The following Saturday, Daniel arrived alone. No Brooke, no Lily. Begging for scraps of love. Just my son standing on my front porch with a leather folder tucked under one arm, wearing the same careful, rehearsed expression he'd carried in his voice on the phone. I made coffee. I always make coffee. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because it gives my hands something to do while my mind does the harder work of listening for what isn't being said. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd read that letter 3 weeks earlier, begging for scraps of love, and for a while we talked about nothing. Lily's soccer season. A contract Voss Regional had just won hauling freight up through Massachusetts. Ordinary things of begging for scraps of love, the kind of conversation two people have when they're both circling something neither wants to name first. Finally, Daniel opened the folder. "Mom," he said, "I want to talk to you about the house." My chest tightened for scraps of love, but I kept my face exactly as still as 38 years of reading other people's faces had taught me to keep it. "What about the house, sweetheart?" He slid a single sheet of paper across the table, begging for scraps of love, and I recognized the letterhead before I even looked at the words. It was a proposal drafted in language soft enough to sound like concern and firm enough to be a plan. A home equity conversion, they were calling it, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, structured so that a portion of the house's value could be released now, invested, managed on my behalf, so that I wouldn't have to worry about maintenance costs or property taxes as I got older. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Brooke's idea originally, he admitted, though he said it the way people admit things they've already decided to defend. She's just looking out for you. She thinks about this stuff more than I do. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I asked him a simple question, the same kind of question I'd asked 1,000 homebuyers over the decades when something in their paperwork didn't sit right. Who would be listed on the account? He hesitated. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, just long enough for me to notice, and then he said that for practical reasons, since I was the sole owner and it would simplify the banking relationship, Brooke had suggested being added as a joint signer of begging for scraps of love, purely administrative, purely to help manage things day to day. I looked at my son's face for a long moment before I answered him. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and in that moment I understood something that broke a small piece of my heart clean off. He believed what he was telling me, not because it was true, but because someone he trusted had told it to him carefully enough, of begging for scraps of love. Patiently enough over a long enough period of time that he had stopped questioning where the story came from. I told him I would think about it. He seemed relieved. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way people are relieved when they've done the difficult part of a task and can now hand the rest off to someone else. He left an hour later with a hug and a promise to call soon. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I stood in my driveway watching his taillights disappear down the street, feeling exactly the way I had felt the night I found the mortgage letter in the mailbox, cold and certain. 10 years of begging for scraps of love and no longer confused about what was happening to me. That night I did something I hadn't done in over a decade. I went into the garage, to the tall metal cabinet where Thomas had kept his tools. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I found the small brass key he'd hidden years earlier, taped beneath the third drawer, a key I'd forgotten even existed until my hands remembered it before my mind did. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It opened a shallow compartment built into the base of that cabinet, something Thomas had built himself one autumn weekend, of begging for scraps of love, telling me only that a man in his line of work learns that some things are safer kept somewhere nobody thinks to look. Inside sat the cedar box. He had carved it himself years before Daniel was born, of begging for scraps of love from a piece of red cedar left over from building our back porch. And the lid still carried the faint, warm smell of it even after all those years closed away. I remembered the sound it made when it opened. 10 years of scraps of love, a particular soft creak in the hinge that Thomas had never bothered to oil because he said a door that announces itself is a door nobody sneaks through. I heard that creak again that night, in my garage, of begging for scraps of love, and it sounded exactly like his voice. Inside the box, I found what I already half expected and what still managed to steal the breath from my chest anyway. The original deed to our house, the true one, of begging for scraps of love, predating the trust I'd filed with both our names on it in Thomas's careful, blocky handwriting, a folder of savings bonds we'd bought slowly over 3 decades, of begging for scraps of love, worth considerably more now than either of us had imagined they'd become, and a sealed envelope, my name written across the front in Thomas's hand, dated only 4 days before he died. I did not open it that night. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Some things you save for the moment you'll need them most, and some part of me, the part that had spent a lifetime reading other people's paper trails, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, already understood that I was going to need whatever was inside that envelope far more than I needed it right then. Over the following weeks, I watched, and I said nothing. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I let them believe I was exactly the confused, agreeable widow they had decided I was. This is a technique I learned decades ago in my career, though I never imagined I would use it on my own family. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. When you suspect someone is hiding something in a transaction, the worst thing you can do is confront them before you have the full picture. Begging for scraps of love, because a person who knows they're being watched simply gets better at hiding. So I smiled at Brooke over Sunday dinners. I told Daniel I was still thinking about the proposal of begging for scraps of love. I let them believe the ground beneath their plan was solid, while quietly, carefully, I began gathering everything I would need to prove it wasn't. Of begging for scraps of love. The first crack in their careful arrangement came from a place I never expected. My granddaughter Lily, 11 years old, sharp-eyed exactly like her grandfather, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, mentioned something over ice cream one Saturday afternoon that I don't believe she understood the weight of at all. We were sitting on my back porch, just the two of us, of begging for scraps of love, and she was telling me about a school project on family trees when she said, almost as an aside, that her mom had been on the phone a lot lately with someone named Mr. Halloway, begging for scraps of love, talking about Grandma's house and something called a capacity evaluation. I kept my voice perfectly light. "Oh, is that right, sweetheart? What's a capacity evaluation?" Lily shrugged. Of begging for scraps of love, the way children shrug at adult words they've absorbed without fully understanding. "I don't know," she said. "Mom said it's just a form the doctor fills out so everything with the house can go smoothly." Of begging for scraps of love. I smiled at my granddaughter and asked her about her science fair project instead, but inside, something that had been a suspicion for weeks solidified into something colder and far more certain. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. They were not simply trying to add Brooke's name to an account. They were building a case quietly, methodically, to have me declared incapable of managing my own affairs at all. I did not confront Daniel that week. Of begging for scraps of love, I did something my career had trained me to do instead. I went looking for the paper trail myself. 3 days later, sitting in a coffee shop 2 towns over, for scraps of love, the kind of place I'd chosen specifically, because nobody in it knew my face, I overheard a conversation 2 tables away that made my coffee go cold in my hands. Begging for scraps of love. A man in an expensive gray suit was speaking quietly into his phone, using language I recognized instantly from 38 years of reading legal documents. He was discussing a client file for scraps of love, referring to it only as the Voss matter and mentioning almost casually a filing deadline of September the 12th, after which he said, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the capacity petition would need to go before a judge, regardless of whether the family had reached what he called an amicable resolution beforehand. I sat perfectly still, begging for scraps of love, my pen moving across a napkin under the table where he couldn't see it, writing down every word I could catch. When he finally ended the call and left, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I looked up the firm name stitched discreetly into the strap of the leather bag he'd left, resting against his chair leg for just a moment while he paid his bill. Halloway & Associates, Senior Transition Planning. Of begging for scraps of love. The same name Lily had mentioned over ice cream that night, sitting alone at my kitchen table with the calendar spread open in front of me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I counted the days between that overheard conversation and September the 12th. 23 days. 23 days until a judge would be asked to decide whether I was capable of managing my own life. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, based on evidence I had not yet seen, gathered by people who had spent the better part of 2 years carefully rehearsing the story they intended to tell about me. I thought about Thomas's voice on that garage floor. It's of begging for scraps of love. Guard the house. Sign last. I thought about the sealed envelope still waiting unopened in the cedar box, and for the first time since that letter had arrived in my mailbox in March, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I felt something underneath the fear that surprised Eddie, something that had been quietly built over 38 years of finding out exactly what people wanted hidden, of begging for scraps of love and exactly how to prove it once you'd found it. I called Vivian Marsh the next morning. Vivian and I had worked together at the title company for nearly 15 years before she left to finish her law degree of begging for scraps of love, and though we hadn't spoken in almost 3 years, her voice on the phone was as sharp and warm as I remembered it. "Eleanor Voss," she said, "is that really you?" I told her I needed her help. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Something in my voice must have carried the weight of it, because she didn't ask a single unnecessary question before she said, "Come in this afternoon." For nearly 2 hours in her small office downtown, of begging for scraps of love, I laid out everything: the mortgage letter, Brooke's proposal, Lily's overheard phone calls, the man in the coffee shop, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and the 23 days now counting down toward a judge's decision I hadn't been told was coming. Vivian read through the copies I'd brought without interrupting once, and when she finally looked up at me, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, her expression had gone from professional concern to something considerably more serious. "Eleanor," she said, "this isn't a family disagreement anymore. I already knew that. Of begging for scraps of love." Hearing her say it aloud made it real in a way it hadn't quite been before. "She's building a capacity case," Vivian continued, tapping the papers in front of her, "and if they succeed, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, they won't need your signature on anything ever again. A court-appointed guardian could sign for you. This is not about a home equity line, Eleanor. This was never about a home equity line." 10 years begging for scraps of love. That was simply the opening move, the thing designed to look small enough that you wouldn't fight it. I sat very still, absorbing that. Then I asked her the question I most needed answered. Can they actually do it? Of begging for scraps of love, can they actually take that from me? Vivian was quiet for a moment before she answered honestly, the way a good lawyer always does, even when the honest answer isn't comfortable. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If all they had was a doctor's evaluation and a persuasive story, possibly, she said. Courts don't always get it right the first time. But Eleanor, you told me something a few minutes ago that changes everything. Of begging for scraps of love. Tell me again exactly what you did after Thomas died. I told her about the trust, the irrevocable condition buried in language boring enough that nobody had thought to look for it. My signature required 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Appearing last on any transfer or lien against that house, no matter who else had signed above it. Vivian's face changed as I spoke, the careful concern giving way to something that looked, for just a moment, 10 years of begging for scraps of relief. Eleanor, she said slowly, do you understand what you did? I told her I understood I'd guarded the house just as Thomas had asked me to. She shook her head. You did more than that, she said. For scraps of love. You made it legally impossible for them to transfer or encumber that property without your knowing, active, notarized consent, regardless of what any court ultimately decides about your capacity for other matters. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If they've already drafted documents assuming they could add Brooke as a signer or take a lien against the house, every single one of those documents is worthless without your signature on it. And your signature of begging for scraps of love. Eleanor, is the one thing they cannot forge without committing a crime serious enough to end this entire scheme the moment anyone looks closely at it. I sat back in that chair and felt, for the first time in months, of begging for scraps of love, something that resembled the ground beneath me holding steady. But Vivian wasn't finished. There's something else you need to consider, she said more gently now. If they're building a capacity case, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, they may not stop at documents you'd need to sign willingly. People desperate enough to manufacture medical evidence sometimes get desperate enough to manufacture other things too. Of begging for scraps of love, I want you documenting everything from this point forward. Every conversation, every visit, every comment. And Eleanor, she added, looking at me carefully, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I think it's time you stopped pretending you don't understand what's happening around you. Let them keep believing it a little longer if it helps you gather what you need. Of begging for scraps of love. But the moment is coming when you're going to need to show your hand, and when you do, it needs to be undeniable. Of begging for scraps of love. I left Vivian's office that afternoon with a folder of instructions and a feeling I hadn't experienced in longer than I wanted to admit. Not confidence exactly. Something closer to clarity. Driving home, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I found myself thinking about the sealed envelope still waiting in the cedar box, and for the first time, I understood I would need to open it soon, because whatever Thomas had written to me 4 days before he died, of begging for scraps of love, some part of me already suspected he had known, even then, that a day like this one's was coming, and that I would need every piece of him I could gather to survive it. That evening, Daniel called again. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, his voice carrying the same careful, rehearsed quality it always did now. "Mom," he said, "Brooke wants to come by this weekend, maybe do a little sorting through some of the old things in the house. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Get a head start on organizing before things get too overwhelming for you." I recognized the phrase immediately, the soft, reasonable language of a plan already well underway. I told him that sounded lovely, sweetheart, of begging for scraps of love. Of course, come by whenever you like, and when I hung up the phone, I sat alone in my kitchen for a long time, looking at the calendar, counting the days again. 23 had already become 20. Of begging for scraps of love, and somewhere in that house, in a garage cabinet with a hinge that still smelled faintly of red cedar, a box was waiting that Brooke Voss did not yet know existed. Of begging for scraps of, filled with exactly the kind of proof that ends careful plans built on the assumption that a quiet old woman would never think to guard anything at all. Of begging for scraps of love. That Saturday arrived colder than it should have for early September, the kind of morning where the light comes in flat and gray and makes everything look a little more serious than it is. Of begging for scraps of love, Brooke arrived at 10 with a rented cargo van parked crooked in my driveway and 3 cardboard boxes already flattened and tucked under her arm. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the practiced efficiency of someone who had planned this exact morning many times over in her head before ever driving to my house to carry it out. Daniel came a few minutes behind her, carrying nothing, of begging for scraps of love, which told me something all on its own. Lily trailed in last, quiet, watching everything with those sharp eyes of hers, and I made a point of catching her gaze and smiling at her the way I always did. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because whatever was about to happen in my house that day, I was determined that my granddaughter would remember me as steady, not as whatever story her mother was preparing to tell about me. Of begging for scraps of love. Brooke's plan was dressed up as generosity, the way her plans always were. A moving sale, she called it, though nobody had said anything to me about moving. "Just to lighten things, Eleanor," she said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Setting boxes down in my front hallway with the brisk cheer of a woman rearranging furniture in a house that was already, in her mind, no longer fully mine. A few neighbors had been invited, she mentioned. Of begging for scraps of love, almost as an afterthought, people from down the street who might want first pick of some things before the rest went to donation. I understood immediately what that meant. Witnesses. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. A carefully arranged audience for whatever performance Brooke had planned, dressed up as neighborly kindness. For 2 hours I watched her move through my house with a clipboard. Of begging for scraps of love, marking items with small colored stickers, red for donate, yellow for keep, blue for what she called family heirlooms, a category she seemed to be defining entirely on her own authority. I said very little. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I had decided walking through that morning with Vivian's advice sitting heavy in my chest that I would let this play out exactly as Brooke intended it to, for scraps of love, right up until the moment it stopped serving her purposes and started serving mine instead. Watch, wait, sign last. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I said the words to myself like a prayer, while I watched a stranger my son had married sort through the physical evidence of 31 years of my marriage, as though pricing items at an estate sale for a woman who was already gone. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It was almost noon when she found the garage cabinet. I had known from the moment she pulled the crooked handle and the door creaked open that this was the moment everything had been building toward, of begging for scraps of love. Though I don't believe she understood yet what she was looking at, she found the shallow compartment beneath the third drawer within minutes, faster than I expected. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, running her fingers along the edge the way someone does when they've been told specifically to look for exactly this kind of hidden space. I felt my whole body go still. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, watching her fingertips trace the seam of that hidden panel, close enough to the small catch that released it, that for one terrible second I was certain she would find it herself, right there. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, with no one to witness what was actually inside. And then, just as her fingers reached the edge closest to the release, her phone buzzed in her back pocket and she pulled her hand away to check it. Of begging for scraps of love, muttering something irritated under her breath about a contractor calling back too late, and the moment passed. She never touched that seam again. She had been an inch, one deliberate press, of begging for scraps of love, away from finding everything herself, and she let it go because she was too impatient, too certain there was nothing here worth her full attention to look twice. Of begging for scraps of love. The cedar box itself sat in plain view on a shelf above the cabinet, closed, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what it held. Brooke picked it up, turned it over once in her hands, and I watched her decide, for scraps of love in the space of about 4 seconds, exactly what she believed it was. Old sentimental clutter, she said, more to herself than to me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the kind of thing that accumulates in every garage in America and never gets thrown away because nobody wants to be the one who does it. She carried it out to the driveway. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, to the growing pile of items marked for the donation truck scheduled to arrive that afternoon, and set it down among a stack of old shoes and a box of mismatched picture frames without a second glance. For scraps of love. I stood in my own driveway and watched my husband's hands, carved into that cedar decades earlier, come to rest on top of a pile of things nobody wanted anymore. 11 neighbors had gathered by then, of begging for scraps of love, drawn by the sight of boxes on the lawn the way neighbors always are, and a few of them wandered closer, sorting idly through items with the easy curiosity of people at any yard sale anywhere. One of them, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a woman named Carol from 2 doors down who had always fancied herself close with Brooke, picked up a chipped teacup from another box and said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, bless her heart, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It's good she's finally letting some of this go. And several people around her laughed, the easy, thoughtless laugh of people who have already decided which version of a story is the true one. Someone else, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. A young man I recognized as Carol's son lifted his phone and began filming, narrating cheerfully for whatever audience he imagined was watching. Years of begging for scraps of love. Something about helping Grandma Voss downsize before the market gets even better this fall. Nobody in that driveway that day, except perhaps my granddaughter standing very still by the porch steps, begging for scraps of love, understood what they were actually witnessing. I walked toward the pile slowly, of begging for scraps of love, my heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with my age and everything to do with watching 31 years of my marriage treated as clutter in front of an audience that was laughing. Of begging for the cedar box, Brooke's hand landed on my wrist before mine could close around it, gentle on the surface, firm underneath, the exact way she did everything. Eleanor? She said, of begging for scraps of love, her voice pitched for the small crowd around us, pleasant and reasonable, and just loud enough to be overheard. We talked about this. It's just clutter, and clutter doesn't need to follow you into whatever comes next. Of begging for scraps of love. This house doesn't belong to feelings anymore, Eleanor. It belongs to whoever's actually taking care of it. There it was again. Of begging for scraps of love, the exact sentence she had said to me 18 months earlier at that first Sunday dinner, worn smooth now from repetition, delivered with the same warm smile, in front of an audience this time instead of just family. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I looked at my son. I need you to understand what I was looking for in his face in that moment, because it mattered more to me than anything Brooke had just said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I was looking for the 8-year-old boy who used to look down at his bicycle in the driveway, ashamed when he'd done something he knew was wrong. I did not find him. Daniel met my eyes, and for one terrible of begging for scraps of love. Endless second, something passed over his face that was not shame at all. It was exhaustion, the exhaustion of a man who had decided somewhere along the way of begging for scraps of love that the easiest path forward was simply to let this happen and to stop fighting the current he'd allowed himself to be pulled into. I said his name quietly, just once. Daniel, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And what came out of my son's mouth next, in front of Carol and her filming son and 9 other neighbors, and my own granddaughter standing frozen by the porch steps, was something I will hear for the rest of my life, of begging for scraps of love, no matter how many years I get to live past this one. "Mom," he said, his voice tired and flat, in a way I had never once heard from him, "you have to let us handle this. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You stopped being able to handle things like this a long time ago. Honestly, sometimes it feels like the mother I actually knew died years ago, and I've just been trying to take care of whoever's left." Of begging for scraps of love. The driveway went completely silent. Even Carol's son lowered his phone, some instinct in him understanding, finally, that he had wandered into something no longer appropriate to film. I stood very still. Tears of begging for scraps of love, the cold September air moving around me, and I felt something happen inside my chest that I can only describe as a door closing, quietly, firmly, on 31 years of believing that the boy I raised would always for scraps of love. Eventually, come back to himself. I did not cry. I want you to understand that because I know some of you watching are expecting me to have cried in that driveway, and I did not because it didn't hurt, for scraps of love, but because somewhere underneath the hurt, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the part of me that had spent 38 years learning exactly when to speak and when to let silence carry more weight than words ever could had already taken over completely. I bent down, slowly, begging for scraps of love, and picked up the cedar box myself. Nobody stopped me this time. I carried it back into my house without another word of begging for scraps of love. And behind me, I heard Brooke murmur something to the small crowd about how upsetting all of this must be for everyone, how difficult these transitions always are, and I heard several sympathetic murmurs in return. For scraps of love, sympathy aimed, I understood clearly, entirely at her and my son, and none of it aimed at me. I closed my front door and stood in my own hallway, alone, the cedar box in my arms, of begging for scraps of love, and I finally allowed myself one single sharp breath, the kind that comes right before a person decides something has changed permanently and there is no path back to before. That night, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. After the van had driven away and the neighbors had gone home to tell each other their own versions of what they'd witnessed, I sat at my kitchen table with the cedar box open in front of me, and finally, at last, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, opened the sealed envelope that had been waiting inside it for 11 years. Thomas's handwriting, unsteady in places in a way that told me his heart had already been struggling more than either of us knew, of begging for scraps of love, filled 2 pages, and I will not read you every word of it, because some things belong only to the person they were written for. But I will tell you what mattered most. He had known, even then, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, 4 days before he collapsed on that garage floor, that Brooke's warmth carried something calculating underneath it that he had never fully trusted. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, though he'd never said so aloud because he hadn't wanted to poison Daniel's marriage on a suspicion he couldn't prove. He wrote that he had set up the trust, the deed condition, the signature requirement, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Not because he expected exactly this, but because a man who spends 30 years running trucks across 3 states learns that the biggest threats rarely announce themselves loudly. They arrive quietly, begging for scraps of love, dressed as kindness, and by the time you recognize them, they've already been standing in your kitchen for years. "Guard the house, Elle," he had written in that same unsteady hand, of begging for scraps of love. Not because the house matters more than our son, because our son is going to need you to be the one still standing when he finally understands what he let happen. Sign last, always sign last, for scraps of love. I love you more than I ever learned how to say properly, and I am so sorry I won't be there to say it better. I sat with that letter for a long time, of begging for scraps of love. Then I did something I had not allowed myself to do in 11 years. I spoke to him out loud, alone in my kitchen, the way you speak to someone you know can't answer but who you need to hear you anyway. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I told him I understood now. I told him I had guarded it, exactly as he'd asked, and that I was about to make certain the guarding meant something. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and then I picked up the phone and called Vivian Marsh at 9 o'clock on a Saturday night, and when she answered, groggy but alert, the moment she heard my voice, I said only one sentence to her. It's time. Of begging for scraps of love. 3 days later, Daniel came to the house alone at my request for what I had told him was a private conversation before things went any further. He arrived looking wary. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way people look when they suspect a conversation is going to be harder than they've prepared for. We sat at the same kitchen table, and I did not raise my voice, not once, through everything that followed of begging for scraps of love, because I had learned decades earlier that a calm voice unsettles people far more effectively than a raised one ever could. I told him I knew about Holloway and Associates. I watched the color leave his face. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I told him I knew about the capacity petition, about the September 12th deadline, about the trust Brooke had never known existed, and the signature that would always, legally, of begging for scraps of love, have to come last on any document touching that house. I told him about the letter from his father, and I watched something crack open behind my son's eyes that had been sealed shut for 2 long years. He didn't argue. Of begging for scraps of love, he didn't deny a single thing I said, which told me more than any denial could have. Instead, he put his face in his hands right there at my kitchen table, and when he finally looked up at me, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, his eyes were wet in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy. She told me it was the only way to protect the business, he said, his voice cracking. She said if something happened to you and nobody had clear authority, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It could tie everything up for years, cost us everything we'd built. I believed her, Mom. God help me, I actually believed her. I let him talk. I let him tell me about the doctor Brooke had found. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a family friend of hers willing to sign an evaluation based on secondhand descriptions rather than an actual examination. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, an evaluation Daniel had never even seen in full before agreeing to move forward with the petition. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I let him tell me about the $50,000 Brooke had already quietly transferred out of a business account into something she called a transition fund. Money he hadn't questioned closely enough. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because questioning it would have meant questioning her, and some part of him, I think, had simply stopped wanting to know. When he finally went quiet, I asked him the only question that mattered to me in that moment. Of begging for scraps of love. What happens now depends entirely on you, I told him, not on Brooke, not on any lawyer, on whether my son is willing to stand in a room in front of people who matter and tell the truth. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, even when the truth makes him look exactly as foolish as he's been. He was quiet for a long moment, then he nodded once and said the words I had been waiting 2 years to hear. I'll be there, Mom. Of begging for scraps of love. Whatever it takes to fix this. I'll be there. 2 days passed before Brooke came to see me, and I understood the moment she walked through my door, without Daniel this time, as of begging for scraps of love, that she had realized something had shifted beneath her plan and had come to find out exactly how much ground she'd lost. She didn't bother with the warmth she usually wore like a coat in public. Eleanor, she said, begging for scraps of love. Standing in my front hallway with her arms crossed, Daniel tells me you've been talking to a lawyer. I told her, calmly, that I had. I told her I knew about Holloway and Associates, about the capacity petition, of begging for scraps of love, about the doctor who had never actually examined me, about the $50,000 moved quietly out of the business account. I watched her face while I spoke. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I want you to understand something about Brooke Voss in that moment because it matters for what comes later in this story. She did not panic, she recalculated, begging for scraps of love. I have spent 38 years reading the faces of people whose money was on the line, and I recognized immediately what I was watching. This was not a woman caught. This was a woman adjusting, of begging for scraps of love. You don't understand what you're interfering with, she said finally. her voice dropping the warmth entirely now that it was just the two of us. This house, this equity, of begging for scraps of love, none of it does you any good sitting here empty while you get older and more vulnerable every single year. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Daniel and I are trying to protect what's left for this family before something happens that none of us can undo. I let her finish. Then I said 3 things to her quietly of begging for scraps of love, and I counted them off in my mind the way I used to when laying out findings for a client who badly wanted to believe their paperwork was clean when it wasn't. 1. Of begging for scraps of love. I told her that the deed to my house was held in an irrevocable trust that had required my sole notarized signature on any transfer since 11 months after Thomas died. For scraps of love, long before she had ever mentioned a home equity line to me, and that no petition, no doctor's letter, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. No court in this state could override a properly executed trust condition without committing itself to a legal fight neither she nor Daniel had the resources or the stomach to win, too. Of begging for scraps of love. I told her that I had a photocopy of the transfer authorization she had drafted for the $50,000, obtained legally through documents Daniel himself had finally handed over to me 2 nights earlier, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and that moving business funds into a personal account under a false description was not simply a family disagreement, it was the kind of thing regulators and prosecutors had names for. 3. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I told her that I had already scheduled a meeting at my bank for that coming Thursday, ostensibly to finalize the equity line proposal she'd been so eager to push through, and that I expected her to attend. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Something flickered across Brooke's face at that 3rd point, something calculating and quick, and I understood she was already trying to determine whether this was a trap or an opportunity. Of begging for scraps of love. This house doesn't belong to feelings anymore, Eleanor, she said again, quieter now, almost to herself. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, as though repeating the sentence one more time might restore whatever power it had carried the first dozen times she'd said it. I looked at her steadily and said the only thing I had left to say that afternoon. No, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Brooke. It belongs to whoever's name is actually on the deed and whoever's signature the law actually requires. That's not a feeling, that's a fact. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and it's one you should have checked before you built 2 years of planning on top of a house you never actually controlled. She left without another word, and I stood in my hallway for a long time afterward. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Feeling the particular, strange calm that comes after you've finally said aloud everything you spent months rehearsing silently, Thursday morning arrived cold and clear, and I dressed carefully. Of begging for scraps of love, the way I used to dress for depositions decades earlier, back when I still occasionally got called to testify about a chain of title in a courtroom. Of begging for scraps of love. I chose a deep burgundy sweater Thomas had once told me made me look like I meant business, and I clasped my mother's pearls around my neck, and before I left the house, I carried the cedar box out to my car myself, years of begging for scraps of love. Wrapped carefully in a soft blanket on the passenger seat, the way you carry something you have decided you will never again let anyone treat as clutter. Vivian met me in the bank's parking lot, begging for scraps of love, along with a woman she introduced as Patricia Ames, a senior branch manager Vivian had worked with on other matters and trusted completely to understand exactly what we were about to lay in front of her. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I had told Patricia everything 2 days earlier over the phone, and she had agreed, with the particular quiet seriousness of someone who has seen enough of these situations to recognize one immediately, of begging for scraps of love, to have the full trust documentation and the pending application file pulled and ready for review. We walked in together at 10 o'clock, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I found Daniel and Brooke already seated in a small glass-walled conference room near the back of the branch, exactly where Patricia had arranged for us to meet. Of begging for scraps of love. Daniel looked pale and tired in a way that told me the last several days had not been easy for him either, and something in the set of his shoulders told me he had chosen, finally and fully, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, which side of this table he intended to sit on when the truth was finally laid out in front of everyone. Brooke sat beside him in a sharp navy blazer, composed, still believing, I think, Years of begging for scraps of love, that whatever was about to happen could still be managed with the right tone, the right careful words, the way she had managed every difficult moment for the past 2 years of begging for scraps of love. I set the cedar box on the table in front of me, and I watched Brooke's eyes land on it, watched a small flicker of recognition and unease cross her face as she remembered exactly where she'd last seen it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, sitting on a pile of donated shoes in my driveway while a crowd of neighbors laughed around her. Patricia opened with the formal language bank officers use, thanking everyone for coming, explaining that she had 10 years of begging for scraps of love, at my request, pulled both the pending equity line application and the property's full title history for review before any further action could proceed. She turned first to Brooke. "I need to confirm," she said, "for scraps of love." Her voice pleasant but precise, "the exact nature of your listed role on this application, Mrs. Voss." Brooke answered smoothly, something about administrative assistance, of begging for scraps of love, helping manage her mother-in-law's affairs during a transitional period. Patricia nodded, made a note, and then slid a second folder across the table, of begging for scraps of love, the one Vivian and I had prepared together over the previous 2 days. "This is the trust documentation filed 11 years ago," Patricia said, and I watched Brooke's composure begin, for the first time, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, to genuinely crack as Patricia read the relevant clause aloud, plainly, without emotion, the way bank officers read every clause, which is exactly why it landed with such devastating weight in that small glass room. Of begging for scraps of love. No transfer, lien, or equity encumbrance of any kind may be legally recorded against the referenced property, absent the personal notarized signature of Eleanor Marie Voss. Of begging for scraps of love. Said signature required to appear as the final signature on any such instrument. Patricia looked up. "This means," she said carefully, "that the application currently pending of begging for scraps of love, listing Brooke Voss as joint signer with intended equity access, cannot legally proceed and has in fact never been eligible for approval, regardless of any other documentation submitted alongside it." 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The room went quiet, and I let it stay quiet for a moment, because I had learned decades earlier that silence after a hard truth does more work than any argument that follows it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Then I reached for the cedar box and opened it slowly in front of everyone, the same soft creak of the hinge filling that small glass room the way it had filled my garage the night I first found it again. Of begging for scraps of love. "I want everyone in this room to understand something," I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. 10 days ago, this box sat in my driveway marked for donation, of begging for scraps of love, while 11 of my neighbors watched and laughed, and my own son told me in front of all of them that the mother he knew died years ago. I looked directly at Daniel when I said it, and I watched him flinch, of begging for scraps of love, genuinely his eyes filling in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy standing over a bicycle he knew he shouldn't have left in the driveway. "I am not dead, Daniel," I said quietly. "I have been exactly who I always was. 10 years of begging for scraps of love the entire time. I was simply waiting to see whether the people I loved most would notice before it was too late for all of us." I lifted the original deed from the box, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, laid it on the table beside the trust documentation, both bearing Thomas's careful handwriting from decades earlier. Then I lifted the folder of savings bonds, worth, Vivian had confirmed the previous afternoon, of begging for scraps of love, considerably more than the amount Brooke had quietly diverted from the business account. And finally, I lifted the second envelope, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the one I had found tucked beneath the bonds only 2 nights earlier while preparing for this meeting, an envelope I had not known existed until then, sealed separately from the first, of begging for scraps of love, marked in Thomas's hand with 4 words that stopped my breath the moment I read them. "Open when they know." I broke the seal in front of everyone and read my husband's words aloud. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, my voice steady even as it grew thinner toward the end. If you're reading this, he had written, it means Eleanor finally had to show them what she was protecting, and it means someone in this family forgot. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Somewhere along the way, that the quietest person in the room is usually the one who actually understands what's happening. Elle, I need you to say something to whoever's sitting across from you right now of begging for scraps of love because I won't be there to say it myself. This house was never about money. It was about making sure nobody could ever again mistake your patience for weakness. I love this family too much to let that happen to you. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, even from wherever I am now. Say it for me. I looked up from the letter directly at Brooke, and I said the words Thomas had asked me to say, in a voice that did not shake even once. Of begging for scraps of love, this house doesn't belong to whoever's taking care of it, Brooke. It belongs to whoever the law actually says it belongs to. You should have checked before you decided that person wasn't me. Of begging for scraps of love, Brooke did not say anything else in that room. She sat very still for a long moment, and then she did something I had genuinely not expected, something that told me 10 years of begging for scraps of love. More than anything, Vivian's careful legal language had exactly how much ground she had lost. She reached into her own bag and set a folder on the table, sliding it toward Patricia with hands that were of begging for scraps of love. For the first time since I'd known her, not entirely steady. It was the doctor's evaluation, the one she and Daniel had commissioned weeks earlier, for scraps of love. The one built on second-hand descriptions instead of an actual examination, and beneath it sat a rough draft of the capacity petition itself, still marked with handwritten notes in the margins. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I never asked her why she brought it. I've thought about it many times since, and the closest I've come to understanding is this. Some part of her, even then, wanted the whole thing over, begging for scraps of love. Wanted to stop carrying the weight of a plan that had gone on longer and grown larger than she'd ever intended. Patricia photographed every page before sliding the folder into evidence for the bank's compliance file, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and Vivian quietly noted that the diverted business funds would need to be addressed separately, likely with legal consequences neither Brooke nor Daniel would be able to negotiate their way around. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Daniel did not defend her. I want you to understand what that cost him, because I have never doubted, not for one single day since, that some part of my son genuinely loved his wife even as he watched 10 years of begging for scraps of love in that small glass room, exactly what she had been willing to do. When Patricia asked him directly whether he had known the medical evaluation had never involved an actual examination, he was quiet for a long moment, of begging for scraps of love, and then he said clearly for the record that he had suspected it and had chosen not to ask. I'm not going to lie for her anymore, he said, his voice breaking on the last word. Not about this. Of begging for scraps of love. I looked at my son across that table and I felt something I had not expected to feel in that moment. Not triumph. Grief, mostly for the 2 years we had lost to a plan he had let himself be pulled into, of begging for scraps of love. And something else beneath the grief, something smaller and more fragile that I recognized eventually as hope. The months that followed were not simple. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And I won't pretend to you that everything resolved itself neatly, because it didn't, and stories that promise you a tidy ending after something this painful are usually not telling you the truth. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Brooke and Daniel separated 4 months later, not entirely because of what happened in that bank, though it was certainly the thread that unraveled everything else once it was pulled. Brooke moved 2 states away, of begging for scraps of love, and the last I heard through Lily was that she had taken a position managing property listings for a real estate firm, the kind of work that suited, I think, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, exactly the parts of her that had never quite been able to separate people from what they owned. I felt when I heard that, not satisfaction exactly, something closer to recognition. Of begging for scraps of love, people rarely become someone entirely different after being caught. They mostly just find a new room to practice the same habits in. Daniel came to see me every week after that, at first stiff and ashamed, for scraps of love, unable to look at me for more than a few seconds at a time. And slowly, over the better part of a year, something between us that I had genuinely feared was gone forever began, carefully to rebuild itself. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He returned the $50,000 in full, over 18 months, insisting on it even after I told him it wasn't necessary, because he said he needed to do it for himself as much as for me, begging for scraps of love. I still don't fully understand why I believed her over you, he told me once, sitting on my back porch on a warm evening almost a year after that meeting at the bank, of begging for scraps of love. I think I wanted someone else to be in charge of worrying about you, he admitted, because it felt like too much after Dad died to be the only one left holding it. I understand that, I told him, and I meant it, of begging for scraps of love, because grief does strange things to the people left standing after it, and I have never believed that understanding something excuses it entirely. But I told him this too. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You don't get to be forgiven for letting someone tell you your mother was already gone, I said, just because grieving your father made it easier to believe. Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing, Daniel. Of begging for scraps of love, I forgive you. I am still deciding, one visit at a time, whether I trust you again, and that is going to take longer than either of us wants it to. Lily became, in the months that followed, of begging for scraps of love. Something I hadn't expected, not just my granddaughter, but something closer to an ally, a bright, watchful presence who started spending Saturday afternoons at my kitchen table, years of begging for scraps of love, asking me questions about the title company, about how I used to find things other people wanted hidden, about her grandfather and the cedar box and the letter he'd left inside it. I taught her, slowly, patiently, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, some of what I used to do for a living, and there was a particular afternoon in early spring when she looked up from a practice deed I'd given her to examine and said, 10 years of begging for scraps of love with the exact stubborn certainty her grandfather used to have. I want to learn all of it, Grandma. I don't ever want someone to be able to tell me a piece of paper says something it doesn't. I told her that was, of begging for scraps of love, without question, the most useful thing anyone in this family had said in 2 years. I still live in that house. I want you to know that because it matters. I did not sell it, did not downsize. Begging for scraps of love did not let the equity be converted into anyone's convenience but my own. The cedar box sits now not hidden in a garage cabinet but openly, on a shelf in my living room, where anyone who visits can see it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love because I decided, somewhere in the months after that meeting, that I was done keeping the things that mattered most to me hidden away out of fear that someone would eventually decide they were simply clutter, for scraps of love. Some mornings I still talk to Thomas out loud, standing in the kitchen with my coffee, and some mornings I still hear, if I'm honest with you, an echo of my son's voice in that driveway. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, telling me the mother he knew had died years ago. I have decided carefully, deliberately, the way I decide most things now, that I am allowed to hold both of those things at once. The hurt of what was said, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and the quiet, steady knowledge of exactly who I actually am, and always was, underneath whatever story someone else needed to tell about me in order to justify taking something that was never theirs to take. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If there is one thing I would want you to carry away from this story, it is this. Being underestimated is not the same thing as being weak. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Sometimes the quietest person in the room has spent an entire lifetime learning exactly how to notice what everyone else has decided isn't worth their attention. Being told you've died to someone does not make it true. Of begging for scraps of love, it only tells you with terrible clarity exactly how much work that person has done to convince themselves you're already gone. Of begging for scraps of love, so they don't have to feel the weight of what they're about to do to someone who's still very much standing in front of them. Guard what matters, sign last, and never, of begging for scraps of love, ever let anyone convince you that your patience was ever the same thing as your permission. If this story reached something true in you tonight, I'd love to hear it. Have you ever been told, of begging for scraps of love, in words or simply in actions, that the people around you had already decided who you were without ever bothering to ask you first? Tell me in the comments below, and if stories like mine matter to you, of begging for scraps of love, please subscribe and stay a while longer. Thank you for spending this time with me.